Hi Year 4. It's really good to see how hard you've been working this week on our Summarising Viper. Well done. We're going to do some more work on summarising today, and then when we finish the lesson we're going to read the next chapter of our class text, and that's chapter 21, The Neighbours and the News.
We're going to carry on with our Summarise Viper and think about the main ideas of a non-fiction text. So this was the think question that we had in yesterday's lesson. What could we do to help stop river pollution? Well, one thing that I think we could do is not throw litter and make sure that we put our rubbish in a bin. So that's one thing that could help to stop river pollution. Here are the tricky words that Mrs. Price introduced in yesterday's lesson. Let's see if we can remind ourselves of them. So we've got chemical, volunteer, algae. Let's read them together. Chemical, volunteer, algae. And do you remember what the root word was in this word? Yes, that's right, it's danger, with the OUS suffix at the end. Dangerous, and the root word is danger. What did you think about this word when you had a go at trying to spell it? So this is the word material. This is another word that you'll come across in our text today. Did you chunk it together? And did you find a way of working out how to spell it? Pause the video and have a go now if you want to, or we'll move on to the next part of the lesson. So here we've got some of the vocabulary again that was introduced in yesterday's lesson. So again, we'll just do a recap today. So our first word was pollution, pollution, and that is harmful waste or rubbish that causes damage to water, land and air. And if something is polluted, it gets very dirty. Discarded, discarded. Well, if something is discarded, it's thrown away. So if we discard something, we'll get rid of it or throw it away. And the last word, fertilizer, fertilizer. Well, fertilizer is a chemical or a natural substance that's added to soil to help plants to grow. And here you can see the tractor is spraying fertilizer on the crops. Okay, so let's think about today's activity then. Well, remember, when we're summarising a text, we're thinking about the main idea. So we can think about these questions here to help us. What is this text telling us about? What is the main idea? Well, we're going to do a your turn bit of the lesson to start with, and we're going to think about this question. What is the main idea of the text that we thought about in yesterday's lesson and that we're going to read together now? So we're going to read the text together. So that'll be an our turn bit of the lesson. But your turn is to think about what is the main idea. So as you read, I want you to think about this question. What is the text actually trying to tell us about? So here's the text from yesterday's lesson. We're going to do an our turn now where we're reading together. So I'd like you to join in with me as I read. But I'd also like you to think about the your turn question, which was, what are the main ideas of this text? What is the text trying to tell us? So let's have a go and read together. River pollution. At its source in the mountains, a stream is sparkling and clear, but further downstream, in the river, human activities cause pollution which can affect plants and animals living in the water. Clear water at the source of a river, and here we can see polluted water in a river. People can easily pollute rivers. Litter, especially plastics that do not rot, can wash into the water from the riverbanks. Discarded rubbish can be very harmful to wildlife, and because of this, many people volunteer to collect litter from riverbanks. Here we can see a volunteer collecting litter from riverbanks. Waste materials from factories and mines are often piped into rivers. All this waste can be dangerous for river life. Adding dirty water to rivers harms plant and animal life. Farmers use fertilizers to help crops to grow, Rain may wash these chemicals into rivers. Fertilizers encourage algae to grow and reduce the amount of oxygen in the water. Without enough oxygen to breathe, fish and other water wildlife die. Here you can see a photograph of fertilizing crops, and here we can see algae, and that's a photo there of the algae that can reduce the oxygen in the water. Okay, so remember you had your turn to think about. What is this text telling us about? What is the main idea? What did you think about that? Okay, so how did you get on with that? So when you read that text with me, what did you think was the main idea? Well, when we read it, we found that the main idea was that rivers were being polluted with waste and how harmful it is to river life. We're going to look at our chili challenges now. So this is a your turn part of the lesson, and we're going to do a layered approach. So we're all going to start at chili 1, and then you're going to progress as far as you can. So let's have a look at the chili 1 challenge. So thinking about the main idea from the text, find the correct answer. So let's have a look. Litter, fertilizers and waste from factories cause rivers to become, I wonder what the right answer is. Is it A, very clean? Is it B, very long? Or is it C, very dirty? So I'd like you to pause the video, have a go, and we'll check in a moment when you're ready. Let's check together. Yes, it was very dirty. It was C, because we found out that if something becomes polluted, it gets very dirty. Okay, here's the chili 2 challenge. So, thinking about the main ideas from the text, summarise by identifying what should be done and why. So here we've got some sentence starters. So we've got the first one, people should not drop litter. The second sentence starter says factories should dispose of their waste responsibly. And the last one, farmers should use fertilisers carefully. So your challenge is to work out independently the ends of these sentences. Which ends of these sentences go with these sentence starters? So you've got to try and work out which ones go with which will help you to summarise the text, to work out the main ideas of the text. So pause the video and write the sentences out in your book or on paper, and then we'll check when you're ready. Okay, so how did you get on with that? Let's have a check together. So for the first one, people should not drop litter. That matches with this one. People should not drop litter because it can get dumped in rivers and some rubbish does not rot away. Factories should dispose of their waste responsibly because if it is pumped through pipes, it can end up in rivers. And then finally, farmers should use fertilisers carefully because rain may wash chemicals from the crops into rivers. And now let's look at the chili 3 challenge. So here we can see the heading that's been used in this text, river pollution. Your challenge is this. Thinking about the main idea, suggest a different heading to the one used in this text. So you've got to think about the main idea of what the text is trying to tell you. Can you think of another suitable heading that still gives the reader a clue as to what the text is going to be about? So pause the video now, have a go at thinking of a different heading, and we'll have a check together in a moment. Okay, let's have a look together. So how did you get on with that? So here are some possible headings that would still give the reader a clue as to what the text was going to be about. So we could have dirty rivers, save your river, or polluted rivers. What did you come up with? And finally, to finish today's lesson, we're going to think about this think question. Can you think of a way to tell people about the importance of keeping rivers clean? So how could you get that message across to people? Have a think, talk to somebody in your house about it, and Mrs. Price will pick up with this again tomorrow. And don't forget to stay and listen to the next chapter of our class text.
And now we're going to read chapter 21, The Neighbours and the News. Sometimes grown-ups can be so confusing that they make you scratch your head. When Officer Martina took me home, Mum was the angriest I had ever seen her before. At first it was scary because she kept shouting things like, "I can't believe you did this," and "What if something had happened to you?" But then she would hug me and hold me so tight that I thought my bones were going to be crushed. I wasn't sure if I was being told off or not. When she had calmed down, Mum made me hot soup and told me to tell her everything. So I told her about Armit's pictures and about what the man and woman on the bus had said about the gates, and the greatest idea in the world, and the emergency plan, and everything that had happened in front of the Queen's Palace. Mum was quiet while I talked, and then, after I had finished telling her everything, she sat still for a long time and didn't say anything at all. I was too scared to say anything else, so I sat on my hands and stared at the table. Finally, Mum opened her mouth to say something, but then the doorbell rang. "Who's that, I wonder?" Mum said. And when she opened the door, Mrs. Gillingham, the neighbour who lived next door to Mrs. Abbey, was standing outside. She always wears lots of necklaces and bright pink nail varnish and long dangly earrings. I like her because she smells like puff pastry, and at Christmas she always gives me a stocking filled with sweets. "Oh, hiya, love," cried out Mrs. Gillingham. She gave me a hug. "Thank goodness you're back safe and sound. But my, that was brave of you, wasn't it? The woman on the news said it was so that you could help the refugees." "Sorry, Mrs. Gillingham," said Mum, frowning. "Did you just say you heard about it on the news?" "Oh, it's all over the telly, all over it," said Mrs. Gillingham excitedly. "I expect you'll hear from the reporters soon." Well, yes, thank you for letting us know, Mrs. Gillingham." Mum started to close the door. "We'd better get some rest, it's been a long day." She waved Mrs. Gillingham out of the door and then looked down at me. The news. Just then the doorbell rang again. "Who is it?" called out Mum. "It's Mr. Rashid," came a man's voice. There was a loud ouch before he added, "And Mrs. Rashid." Mum looked at me in surprise and opened the door again. This time, exactly where Mrs. Gillingham had been standing, were Mr. and Mrs. Rashid. They lived one floor below us and have twins. You can tell when they're home because they always leave the pushchair in the landing. It's too big to fit through their front door. We usually only ever see them in the lift or when they need help getting the pushchair out of the main door. But I like them, especially Mrs. Rashid, because she wears the brightest clothes. Once she wore a long flowing dress that had millions of tiny sequins on it and made her shine like a goldfish. She's always smiling and laughing with the babies, and Mr. Rashid likes to shout out the cricket scores to anyone he can find. But this was the first time they had ever come to our flat. "Hello," said Mum. Mrs. Rashid held up her phone. "We've just read all about it," she cried, shoving it into Mum's hand and pointing to a news story with a picture of lots of palace guards standing around someone lying on the floor. "You were so brave. Now the Queen herself can't ignore what's happening to those families. I haven't slept for months thinking about it. Months. It makes me so angry. All those poor people with their little babies just trying to live. We send baby clothes and shoes whenever we can, but we don't have much money to spare," continued Mr. Rashid, his voice suddenly heavy and wobbly. "And now," Mrs. Rashid spotted me over my mum's shoulder and bent down. "Oh, you darling, please let me hug you." I hesitated for a moment. I don't always like being hugged, but Mrs. Rashid seemed nice. So I slowly walked over to her and let her hug me. and then I hugged her back. If your refugee friend needs any help, any at all, please tell us, she said, touching my cheeks. Yes? Promise? Said Mr. Rashid, his eyes big and serious. I nodded, because I knew Ahmet would probably like Mr. and Mrs. Rashid and wouldn't mind me asking them for help. Good. Now you take care, grinned Mr. Rashid, as he and Mrs. Rashid turned away and headed down the stairs. Well, this is turning out to be quite a day, isn't it? Laughed my mum, looking down at me and giving my shoulders a squeeze. But before she could close the door, Mr. Gregg's huge head suddenly popped in. I took a step back and hid behind my mum, because I don't like Mr. Gregg's at all, even though he always dresses in a suit and takes his hat off whenever he sees anyone he likes. I can tell Mum doesn't like him either, because she never says hello to him when we see him, and my mum always says hello to everyone. Even the man who sleeps in the doorway of Mr. Polzecki's shop on the corner of our road. Yes, Mr. Greggs, what can I do for you? Asked Mum in her most polite voice. She only ever uses that voice when she talks to people she doesn't like Aunt Christina, or the man with the clipboard who calls himself landlord. Mr. Greggs cleared his throat and said, I've just dropped by to say that your daughter there would do well to mind her own business. Those pesky refugees are only here because they want a piece of our benefits pie. She ought to know better, and you ought to have taught her better. I looked up at Mum's face and saw that it had gone as white as one of our dinner plates, and she stared at Mr. Greggs without blinking. Have you finished? She said, in a voice that was so cold I didn't recognise it. All I'm saying is that your child was nearly killed today for immigrant pests that want the easy life without having to work a day for it. I mean, I know you're not exactly white, but you've been here long enough to know better, surely. Mr. Greggs, that is quite enough, said Mum, her voice cold and formal. Her eyes had narrowed and her hands had become tight little balls. You and your views are not welcome here. Please leave. And, taking a step back, Mum slammed the door shut just as loudly as she could, so that 1 second Mr. Greggs was there and the next second he wasn't. We could still hear him ranting at us from the other side, but after a few seconds his voice started to get fainter and fainter. Despicable man, muttered Mum, clicking the extra bolt on the door shut. With his dinner jackets and silly neckerchiefs trying to cover up his bigotry. Why is he so angry, Mum? I asked, slipping my hand into hers. And why did he call refugees pests? Because he's a heartless, selfish man who hates everyone far too much to want to help anyone, said Mum, even refugee children like Ahmet. Oh, I said, wondering how anyone could hate someone who was running away from bullies and bombs. Mr. Greggs had clearly never met someone like Ahmet before, because if he had, he could never have been so horrible about anyone who had to become a refugee. Now let's forget about Mr. Greggs and go and see what the news is saying about you, shall we? She ruffled my hair and then went and switched on the telly, as I did a running jump onto the sofa. After a few seconds, a newsreader flashed up onto the screen. Her voice was warm as she said, Today, an incident at Buckingham Palace added a few extra steps to the changing of the guard ceremony as a 9-year-old child ran out and intercepted one of the Queen's Coldstream Guards. As she talked, the picture changed and I appeared on the screen, running out of the crowd and reaching up to touch the palace guard's arm, with Tom just a few steps behind me. I looked so scared that it made me wonder how I had done what I did. I had never, ever seen anyone I know on the television before, and it was the strangest thing in the world to not only see myself on it, but to have done something that a newsreader was talking about. It transpired that the child in question wanted to hand a note for the Queen, appealing for help on behalf of a refugee boy searching for his parents, following their joint escape from the ongoing conflict in Syria. We are expecting an official response from Buckingham Palace later this evening. Mum quickly flicked over to the next channel. Another newsreader was talking, and behind him was another picture of me, looking shocked and scared. The Queen's Guard had an unexpected encounter today as a young child broke through the barriers during the famed changing of the guard ceremony. It is said the attack was made in protest against the government's poor handling of the refugee crisis. "But I didn't attack anyone," I cried out. Mum nodded but didn't say anything, and instead switched the channel to another newsreader. The third newsreader confused me the most, because he said, "A 9-year-old child sparked a terrorist alert today after disturbing the changing of the guard ceremony and raising wider questions about security." Mum leaned over and turned off the sound. "But I didn't want to hurt anyone," I said, trying not to cry. "Why do they think I'm a terrorist?" Mum sighed sadly and, opening up her arms, pulled me towards her. "There are lots of silly people in the world, darling. People who are so afraid of anyone who doesn't look like them or dress like them or eat the same food as them, that they call other people, even children like you, all sorts of silly names." "But I eat everything," I said, confused, "except broccoli and beans. And what's wrong with what I wear?" "Nothing at all," said Mum. "But they might still be scared of you because you don't look like them," she said, stroking my hand. "So I'm scary just because I look different?" I asked. Mum nodded. "Yeah, it's silly, isn't it?" I leaned back against my mum and fell into a deep thought. That's when your brain falls down into a giant hole in the middle of your mind and has to try and put all the pieces of a thought together so that it makes sense. And because your brain is working so hard, you can't think or talk about or see anything else. All you can really do is think about the deep thought. The deep thought my brain had found was wondering how anyone could be scared of me just because I didn't look like them. Everyone in school looks different and likes different things and has parents who come from all kinds of different places. Tom's mum and dad come from different places in America, one called Florida and the other called California. Michael's mum comes from a place called Nigeria, and his dad comes from France, which is why he always goes on lots of holidays and has even seen a giraffe and an elephant in the forest. Josie's mum comes from Barking and her dad comes from Bradford, which is why they speak differently, and her dad always sounds like he's asking a question, even when he isn't. And Mum and Uncle Lenny were both born in a faraway place I'd never been to, called Indonesia, and my dad was born in Austria. Mrs. Abbey once said that I was lucky to have parents from different places because it meant I never needed to go on holiday to get a suntan. I like looking like I have a suntan, and I like everyone being different. It would be too boring if everyone was exactly the same as each other. "Mum," I asked, because the deep thought was starting to give me a headache, "does that mean the Queen's Special Guards were scared of me too?" Mum looked at me and asked, "Did they seem scared of you?" "No," I said, after thinking hard. "They were nice." "Well then," she replied, stroking my hair, "the thing you have to remember is that for every silly person who's afraid of you, there are at least 20 people who aren't silly at all." "OK," I said, feeling better. It was good to know that there were more nice people in the world than there were silly people in it. Just then, a face I knew popped up onto the television screen. "Oh, Mum, look, it's the taxi man," I shouted excitedly. "He took us from the station to the Queen's Palace, and he wouldn't take our money." Mum put the sound up and we both listened as a big red sign with "Stan O'Connell, taxi driver," popped up underneath the picture of his smiling face. "Oh, they were just kids," he was saying cheerfully. "Innocent kids, you know." A man next to him, who must have been the reporter because he was holding a microphone, said, "And you didn't get the impression they were planning any sort of protest or attack?" Mum made an angry sound in her throat and I saw her shake her head. But Stan the taxi man smiled again and said, "I didn't get that impression because that wasn't what happened. You can ask me another 5 times though, if you like." That made Mum burst out laughing, and she said she was glad that I had met a cabbie who was as good and as funny as my Uncle Lenny was. Just then the phone started to ring. It was my Uncle Lenny checking to make sure I was okay. And after he rang, lots of other people rang too. But they weren't people we knew. They were reporters from newspapers. In the end, Mum turned the phone off and said it was time to put this adventure to bed, because tomorrow would bring with it a brand new adventure to go on. Mum let me go to bed a whole 30 minutes late that night because I wanted to watch the news again. Lots of people had taken pictures and videos of me running out into the road. It was strange seeing things that I hadn't been able to see for myself at the time, even though I had been there and it had all happened to me. I hadn't realised how exciting it had been. As soon as I had run out into the road, the police had started shouting and moving the crowd back and surrounding me in a big circle, and all the special guards had stopped playing their drums and trumpets and slammed the palace doors shut. It felt as if I was watching a movie starring someone that looked like me but wasn't me at all. I lay in bed that night trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but my brain felt fuzzy and tired, so in the end I gave up and closed my eyes. None of it really mattered anyway. What mattered was that we had given our note to the special guards, and they had given us their word that they would tell the Queen about Ahmet. And just as soon as they did, she would send out her special guards to find Ahmet's family before the gates closed shut, and it was too late.